I'd like to start with a poem. It's a poem by Gary Snyder to remind us why we do this work and who we do this work for. It's called For the Children. The rising hills, the slopes of statistics lie before us, the steep climb of everything going up as we all go down. In the next century, or the one beyond that, they say, our valleys, pastures, we can meet there in peace if we make it. To climb these coming crests, one word to you and your children. Stay together. Learn the flowers. Go light. Well, folks, we know we're in for some heavy shit. What's less certain, though certainly possible, is that we're also well into what Joanna Macy calls the Great Turning, into a new, more ecologically tuned and socially just future. Either way, the challenges may be huge, but the company is going to be spectacular. Thanks to all of you for being here, comrades. The greatest mistake anybody can make, I think, is to imagine that they can sit this one out, to retreat into a gated community or an exclusive ideology or any defeatist state of mind. We are all in this together, as David Lewis reminded us. So upright and aware, we need to give this adventure everything we've got. We need to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. We need to create and deploy green technologies galore. But we need more than anything else, I think, is to create a massive influx of social imagination, envisioning new ways and revitalizing long-sustained old ways of living within our means on this very different earth. And if we can acknowledge that we're going to be facing unprecedented challenges to our accustomed ways of living, we might ask, what peoples have gone through these kinds of experiences before? What peoples have learned to deal with massive, rapid changes and managed to persist, even thrive over long periods of time? Well, middle-class white people aren't the first ones that come to mind. But Native Americans come to mind. Native people everywhere come to mind. African Americans come to mind. All disadvantaged minority people come to mind. Poor people come to mind, not as a romanticized idea, but as evidently resourceful communities. So it's important for us to recognize our own relative privilege and to work to alleviate the unfair burdens that marginalized people everywhere suffer from all kinds of social and environmental injustices. But it's also important to realize that these folks may know things that we don't know. They may have strengths that we don't yet have. I believe that people of what we call disadvantaged communities have important skills and lessons to share if we'll pay respectful attention. So that's what we get to do this afternoon, because we're going to hear from three wonderful speakers, Rob Nixon, Susana Almanza, and Carolyn Finney, who will shine three lights on different communities and on different ways of addressing our challenges. So first I want to introduce Rob Nixon. Rob is the Rachel Carson Professor of English at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His writing has appeared in the New Yorker and the Atlantic Monthly and frequently in the New York Times. His books give evidence to his wide-ranging interests in environmental studies, post-colonial studies, creative nonfiction, African literature, world literature, 20th century British literature. He intellectually travels all over the place. I'm particularly grateful for the powerful insights and the eloquent prose of his most recent book, Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. Just the title alone gives me shivers. Slow Violence and the Environmentalism of the Poor. The book asks, how can environmental writers craft emotionally involving stories from disasters that are slow-moving and attritional rather than explosive and spectacular, the kind that always make the news. But the devastating slow ones, global warming, oil spills, deforestation, a host of others, don't make the news, even though they're among the most pernicious kinds that people suffer. His book has helped me see slow violence and understand it and imagine ways to address it. I particularly appreciate his attention to the roles that writers and artists and activists have played and must play in resisting exploitation of communities and of nature and of shaping stories of alternative scenarios. Slow Violence tells of some of the creative ways that writers and filmmakers have risen to face the narrative challenges posed by pervasive, slow environmental disasters. His work has done a great service to us with this book. Please join me in welcoming Rob Nixon.
Do I need to unplug this? Oh, okay. There we go. Back. Right. Okay. Well, thanks so much, Charles and Carly and everybody at Spring Creek for putting this together, and particularly grateful to be here. I've worked as a public intellectual. I teach public writing in the MFA program at Wisconsin. And so I'm always delighted at opportunities to cross over between university communities and wider activist and artistic communities. So I want to pick up really where Charles started with talking a little bit about slow violence and our assumptions about what violence is. So typically we think of violence as explosive, as instantaneous, as spectacular, as erupting into immediate visibility. We also think of violence typically as targeted at a body or a specific set of bodies. And so what I want to talk about today is a very different kind of violence, an incremental violence, an attritional violence, a violence that within the environment and within the bodies of those who inhabit the environment can have an exponential effect, but it's over the long durée. So what I'm interested in is the emergencies of the long term as a form of violence. And Charles mentioned some of the types that are so prevalent in our environment today, from climate change, biomagnification, toxic drift, the nitrates coming down the Mississippi, creating a dead zone in the Gulf larger than New Jersey, deforestation, desertification, and on and on. And one of the most important, military residues in the environment. So I'm interested in this both from an activist point of view and from an artistic point of view. In other words, it's a strategic challenge, how to animate these long, sprawling events, and it's an imaginative challenge. How do we condense them? How do we represent them in such a way, in stories, in images, in symbols? How do we represent them in such a way that they can have an emotionally charged effect? Now clearly, we can talk about slow violence not only in terms of the environment, we can talk about it in terms of domestic violence. If we think of, say, the impact over time of a locked door can be as emotionally devastating and as deeply violent, if not more so, than a more visible blow that leaves bruises and blood. So I'm interested here in strategies from an activist point of view and from an artistic point of view in how to represent forms of violence that suffer from a drama deficit, that are spectacle deficient, in an age where that typically reveres spectacle, that is addicted to spectacle, and also an age where our attention spans are increasingly fractured. How do you maintain that view over the long haul? I think it was the former Microsoft executive, Linda Stone, who talked about us as living in a continuous state of partial attention. And this continuous state of partial attention puts pressure on our ability to concentrate on and represent these long, protracted forms of violence over the long haul. So let me just focus this in a little bit in an image. Okay, this is from the early 50s. And this woman in evident, robust, good health is drinking a root beer and eating a hot dog. Now, she seems to be in seventh heaven. She's got this on cloud 9, whatever. This image from the early 1950s was part of a particular marketing project. At the end of World War II, there were large reserves of DDT, and there were rumors going out there that DDT might be toxic. And so there were both corporate and government initiatives to allay Americans' fears. So what they did was they sprayed her with DDT, okay, and said, look, she's fine. She's living the good life, okay? So here what you have is a radical compression of time to an image. It's sort of maybe the equivalent of saying, wow, it's snowing in Atlanta. There's no global warming, no climate change, because, hey, how could that be? So you confuse the weather with the climate, and here what they're encouraging people to do is to confuse the weather of DDT with the climate of DDT, as it were, okay? The long time frame of what constitutes safety and health. So to take another example, if we go back to the Deepwater Horizon, we're talking about the difference between the charge of the event and the slow lapping of the slick of oil and the kind of slurry of oil and corrects it, that becomes a much more corrosive form of violence over the long haul. Now, if we go back to Rachel Carson, she was teasing out some of these ideas in Silent Spring, and there was a particular phrase of hers that resonates for me, and she talked about the struggle to alert people to what she called death by indirection, death by indirection. In other words, the idea of ricochet deaths or oblique deaths that eluded the news because they weren't head-on, they weren't dramatic. And she also talked about, in this context, Rachel Carson talked about the struggle from a storytelling point of view to create drama out of these stories that were which are formless and obscure, these threats that are formless and obscure. So she was interested in the formal challenges as an artist of giving form to these rather diffuse, amorphous forms of threat and violence. Let me ground it also by talking, giving a couple of examples in terms of military residues and slow violence. Just recently I was reading a New York Times editorial where it talked about how Americans had killed during the 12 years of the Vietnam War, Americans had killed or been involved in the death of 1.5 million Vietnamese. Now, the word that I want to bring into focus there is during, because we know that particularly in regions of Vietnam that were heavily sprayed with Agent Orange, like around Bien Ho, 3 generations later, there are still peoples whose lives are being foreshortened by the effects, by the violence of delayed effects, by the outsourcing over the generations of the impacts of those acts. So when we think of war casualties, we very often frame wars in a very environmentally narrow way that produces discounted casualties, both human and environmental discounted casualties, just from the very way that we're able to bracket what constitutes violence and the time frame, the narrow time frame in which that occurs. If we move on to the arrival of depleted uranium weaponry, starting with the first Gulf War in 1990, here we're talking about, for the first time, weapons that have a radioactive legacy of 4.51 billion years. Okay? Low-level radioactivity, but still a radioactive permeation of the land within a time frame that quite simply we cannot imagine. And even in parts of the US military, there's an acknowledgement of this issue. And this is Colonel James Norton talking about depleted uranium munitions. We feel we have to use depleted uranium. It's radioactive. I wish it wasn't, but I can't change the laws of physics. The issue is, once you've had a hit, once you've been involved in the catastrophic failure of the tank, did the crew survive long enough to really care whether it was tungsten, which is an alternative, or depleted uranium that hit them? Anyone who does survive should count themselves damn lucky. I'm sure every soldier would thank God that he lived 40 years to contract lymphoma. Okay. So what he's acknowledging here is the multi-speed lethality, the multi-speed consequences of injecting this into the landscape, whether from the point of view of veterans or obviously from the point of view of inhabitants, the Iraqis and so forth. So I want to turn this around a little bit and look at the way that some writers and artists and activists have responded to these challenges and try to rethink them in terms of our environmental priorities. Now, many of you may have heard of Wangari Maathai, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. And she was associated with the Green Belt movement in Kenya, which was started in 1977 by a group of 7 rural women who saw that the violent misuse of the land through the privatization of what had been commons, through the soil erosion, again through mismanagement, had really deeply affected the lives of rural women who then were dealing with topsoil loss. They had to walk further to get firewood, they had to walk further to get water, and they developed together this project of regreening Kenya, of afforestation. And so over the next couple of decades, Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement planted something like 100 million trees. And on the understanding that the trees would help anchor the soil, the trees would provide shade and prevent the streams from drying up. And also, the trees had made a physical difference in the environment and in the lives of rural Kenyan women. But those trees also, in a sense, were a work of art. They were a symbolic importance. So when the authoritarian regime, this is in the 80s and 90s in Kenya under Arap Moi, when attacked them with machetes and weapons, they held up the saplings of peace. And they planted these trees, and they were uprooted, and they replanted them. And their actions in tree planting were deemed by the regime insurrectionary. Okay? This was a form of civil disobedience. And one of the ways in which it was insurrectionary was that they were stepping out of the acceptable time frame of a kleptocratic government, which is we grab everything now while we can. They were saying, these trees will be here when we're gone. We won't even be alive to see the benefits, but that is the time frame in which we need to act to reverse this violation of the land. And in her memoir, there's this quote at Wangari Maathai that really resonates for me, where she says, during the rainy season, thousands of tons of topsoil are eroded from Kenya's countryside by rivers and washed into the ocean and lakes. Additionally, soil is lost through wind erosion in areas where the land is devoid of vegetative cover. Losing topsoil should be considered analogous to losing territory to an invading enemy. And indeed, if any country were so threatened, it would mobilize all available resources, including a heavily armed military, to protect the priceless land. Unfortunately, the loss of soil through these elements has yet to be perceived with such urgency. Okay? So what she's calling for here is an urgent response to an elongated trauma. And she's also trying to redefine national security in terms of sustainable security, in terms of a long-term vision. And indeed, when the Greenbelt Movement and Wangari Maathai were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2005, it caused quite a stir, because a number of people, including those on the Norwegian committee, said, listen, we've got wars in Afghanistan, we've got wars in Iraq. What does planting trees have to do with war and peace? This is not our framework. And she replied by saying these were preemptive acts of war avoidance, by saying if you stabilize the soil, if you create plenty, you are avoiding those resource bottlenecks that we all know cause the militarization of the environment, cause inflame ethnic divisions and so forth, as we've seen over and over again. So this idea of the tree planting as an act of preemptive, both a physical act that is a gesture towards generations ahead, and a preemptive act of peace. So that became a foundation for a broader grassroots movement. So the kind of biological or vegetative metaphor of the grassroots was literally there in the roots that they were putting down into the soil, and trying to regenerate civic society from there. Now, this may be a familiar image to some of you. There was a movie called The Island President. And I want to just look at a couple of theatrical examples of people trying to get around, imaginatively, this question of slow violence. This is Mohamed Nasheed, who is the president of the Maldives. Maldive Islands, a little chain of atolls in the Indian Ocean. And this was just before the Copenhagen Climate Summit. And he was looking to do something dramatic, to say, we live on an island state that nobody knows about, virtually, certainly the big powers, who are consuming carbon and emitting CO2, are, to them, we're irrelevant. And he was saying that, how can I communicate? How can we communicate as a small island nation of 300,000 people? Our plight, the highest point in the Maldives is 7 feet, which is about Yao Min's height, I think. They were facing inundation, likely to be one of the first 2 or 3 states in the world to become in toto climate refugees with the disappearance of land. Okay? So what he did then was he held this underwater cabinet meeting in an act of kind of subaqueous theater, where he signed into law a commitment to being carbon neutral within 10 years. Okay? So this is a country that's very small, almost invisible in terms of global geopolitics, also has contributed virtually nothing to the climate crisis, but used this theatrical scene to try to dramatize the urgency in an image of something that is happening over decades. Okay, I teach at a big public university, so I know what drowning in paperwork means. But this is drowning in paperwork with a vengeance. Okay, but he's talking about a sea change. He's talking about rising oceans, ocean acidification, all the things that affect the long-term viability, not only of the Maldives, but of analogous island states and low-lying countries like Bangladesh. So, the thing that interests me in this image, as part of this series, is the Maldivian flag at the bottom there. We associate flags with mountain peaks, with vertical conquest. This is an inadvertent sinking of the nation state, the planting of the flag on the sea bottom here. And why it stood out for me was that just at about this time, there was another flag planted by a Russian expedition on the bottom of the Arctic, North Russia. And this flag was paired with an official Russian announcement saying, "The Arctic is Russian." Okay? And I started thinking of these two flags together and what they meant, their different symbolism. The Russian flag was a belletristic gesture of claiming of a global behemoth, claiming more of the mineral and oil rights under the sea, which sparked immediately militaristic responses from other Arctic bordering states, and produced in some sense a new round of the race to the bottom in terms of climate change. And so, if you excuse the pun, I mean, these two flags in a certain way are carbon copies of each other. The one is an appeal to slow down the forces of inundation, and the other is an appeal to claim the very resources that will accelerate that process. One other thing I would notice about the Mohamed Nasheed's little underwater theatre here is the language of submersion, of drowning, of inundation. In the rich white nations of the North, we're very used to that language in relation to immigration, talking about the threat of being swamped by immigrants, or being drowned by immigrants, or being inundated by immigrants. One of the things with climate change is the impact on brown bodies in places like Maldives, places like Bangladesh, places like Niger, of a 230, 240-year high-intensity carbon extraction, consumption business that has disproportionately benefited the white, rich nations, and disproportionately will affect and is affecting the brown nations of the world. And this is clearly a fundamental premise of the climate justice movement. And so I think these images really bring a lot of these issues alive. Now, here's another example of the theater to do with the threat of slow violence. And this time it's from Bolivia. Towards the end of 2012, Evo Morales, who's the first indigenous president of Bolivia, gave the go-ahead for a Brazilian company to build a highway through the lowlands of Bolivia. And the native peoples in that area were instantly protesting. And they said, we know what happens when roads are built, colonists come in, you have illegal deforestation, you have an inrush of armaments, We have all sorts of external threats. We do not want the road. You call the road development, we call it disaster. Okay. So what they did was they marched, and you don't see the band here, but they have drummers and up front. They decided to march to the capital. The march was about 500 miles long. It took them about 3 months. And if you talk about mounting a protest, I mean, they ascended something like 13,000 feet. La Paz is very high. And drummed up support through the band, through the singing, and had indigenous people all the way along join them until the march swelled. And they got to the plaza in La Paz, and they said, this road is disastrous for Native people, it's disastrous for our survival, disastrous for the biodiversity, we don't want it. And Evo Morales, who had been elected as pro-indigenous and pro-environment, backed down, and the road didn't happen. But what you had then, in response to the threat of the slow violence of the road, was a slow protest. It took 3 months to build. You had the media coverage, you had all sorts of resonances going off, both within Bolivia and beyond. And they were, in the end, successful. So I'll end with a few more images that I think try to get to this challenge of slow violence creatively. That's self-explanatory. An allusion to one of the most famous images of wartime violence as a way of compressing the diffuse violence of BP in this case. Another example, we have the drip, which is the drip from the pump, the drip of blood also, and the hanged man. Now, this isn't just any hanged man. It's a man called Ken Saro-Wiwa, who some of you may have heard of, who was an activist in the late 80s and early 90s in Nigeria, in the Niger Delta area. He came from a very small tribe called the Ogoni, about 500,000 of them in the 140 million Nigerians. And they had historically depended on fishing, on the mangroves at the mouth of the Niger River, and it was an area of great wealth in terms of the fisheries, the natural nurseries, and the biodiversity of the Delta area. Shell and Chevron came in, and over the course, after oil was discovered, I think 1958, over the next 4 decades, there was equivalent of an Exxon Valdez every year in terms of spillage, leakage, explosions, and so forth. But it was attritional. There wasn't an event. It was non-eventful catastrophe, uneventful catastrophe. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was a writer. He had a TV series. He was a poet. He was a memoirist. He was a novelist. And he had a lot of visibility in Nigeria. But he was very traumatized by the seeming impossibility of drawing international attention to the plight of the Ogoni people and the other people living in the Niger Delta, because basically their fisheries were being despoiled, the land was being despoiled, the crops were dying, and so forth. He came to the United States and in Colorado saw a battle against logging waged by environmentalists, and they were victorious in stopping logging this particular forest. And he said, wow, he said, this environmental language seems to really resonate. Maybe if I describe what's happening in Nigeria as environmental, people will listen. So he went to Greenpeace, he went to World Wildlife Fund, he got no response until he said, this is an environmental struggle, this is ecocide. And suddenly there was a resonance. And for me, this was a very important moment. It was the first environmental struggle that I was involved in through a Nigerian friend called Claude Ake, And Ken Saro-Wiwa and 8 of his colleagues, those are the names there, were arrested and detained, and we were campaigning for their release. Eventually, a month or 2 later, they were all executed and became the first highly visible environmental martyrs in Africa. But it created a lot of pressure on Shell in particular, and also Chevron, and gave environmentalism, I think, the beginnings of a different reputation in Africa. Because I grew up in South Africa, and at this point, I would not have said that environmentalism had any relevance to South Africa or other parts of Africa, because what I saw, and what I think most people there saw, was a kind of fortress conservation, where environmentalists in Geneva or DC or London or New York would generate decisions, and without consultation of communities on the ground. And quite rightly, you had a lot of Africans saying environmentalism is just green racism, or it's green imperialism, or that it has nothing to do with us. But with Ken Saro-Wiwa's movement and Wangari Maathai's movement, you had beginnings of a very different reputation for environmentalism. Now, clearly, communities in Africa and elsewhere in the global south have long had environmental values. They just hadn't been framed in that way. So Ken Saro-Wiwa was a very significant figure, both for me personally and I think more broadly for environmentalism in the global south. One final comment about this image is that I came across this mural. It's a huge mural, not in Nigeria, but in the west of Ireland, in a place called Rossport. And I was out there a couple of summers ago, and the fisher folk in the village of Rossport were fighting Shell. Shell was drilling for gas, and they were appropriating a whole lot of commons there and taking the gas lines over the farmlands, and they were radically unsafe. They had not had to undergo any environmental viability reports or anything like that. And the people, they were up in arms. They said, we've been fishing here for centuries. This is really damaging and endangering our bay and also the farmland and that. And then they heard about the struggles that the Nigerian people in the Niger Delta had been fighting, and they said, oh, we have a common enemy. We should share strategies and that. And they started renaming the streets in this Irish village after the executed Nigerians. And to me, that was a really radical thing, that people could, that an artist like this could take up the image of an environmental martyr whose death was largely to do with Shell's complicity with the military regime in Nigeria, and say, yes, he's one of us as well. And we here in this poor, rural, and historically colonized part of the west of Ireland actually understand something of what that struggle was about, because we're living it today. Also, that's a poem of Ken Saro-Wiwa's translated into Gaelic. I never thought I'd see that up in a mural. But it does remind us that there are these improbable connections that are achieved through activism and through art, stimulated through art, that travel in unexpected ways and can energize people across boundaries. My final image is a Banksy image, and it's from his series, the Bethlehem series that he put together about Palestine. And I find this a very powerful image because it speaks to the longue durée. What you have here is a vertical cross-section of time and the deep resonances of a surface act. So there is a way in which this isn't just any kind of act of violence, but it is a decapitation. It's a separation of the mind from the living body of the land, from the arterial life of the land. And if we think in terms of the Anthropocene, which is a form of thought that has become increasingly resonant in recent years, the idea that for the first time in the history of the planet, a sentient species, Homo sapiens, is not only having an impact on the living forms of the planet, but also having a geologically discernible set of impacts that we can read off the strata of the soil and the rock. In other words, that we are geomorphic actors in the planet. And that the rise of, since the Industrial Revolution, the rise of our transformative powers will be legible 10, 20, 30,000 years from now in the rock. So I read this as a very powerful Anthropocene image of the layers that where geology and biology, in a sense, are inseparable. The biological and geological fate of the planet are inseparable, and simple, short-sighted surface acts resonate all the way down. I'll leave it there. Thank you.